Rewriting the story you tell yourself, the psychology of narrative identity, and cognitive restructuring. We're all by nature storytellers, from the moment we wake up until we drift off into sleep. A continuous, often silent monologue plays in our minds. We narrate our success, audit our failures, and project our anxieties into the future. In psychology, this is known as narrative identity, the internalized and evolving story of the self that an individual constructs to provide their life with unity, purpose, and meaning. That comes from McAdams, 2001. However, the problem arises when these stories become rigid, self-defeating, or tethered to past drama. If you believe your story is one of not being good enough or always being the victim, that narrative becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In this episode, we're going to explore how internal narratives shape our identity, confidence, and behavioral patterns, and examine evidence-based strategies for rewriting these scripts to foster psychological resilience and personal growth. The mechanics of narrative identity, how stories become reality. According to Dan McAdams' theory of narrative identity, we do not simply find our identities, we author them. We select certain life events, interpret their significance, and weave them into our coherent plot. The plot acts as a lens through which we view the world. If a person views an early academic failure as evidence of a lack of inherent intelligence rather than a temporary lapse in study habits, they will likely avoid academic challenges in the future to protect their ego. This process is closely tied to self-schema story. A schema is a cognitive framework that helps us organize and interpret information. Once a narrative schema, such as "I am a failure," is established, the brain begins to engage in confirmation bias. We subconsciously seek out evidence that supports our negative narrative while disregarding information that contradicts it. And that's from Beck, 1979. The impact on confidence and behavior. Confidence is rarely an objective measure of ability. It is a byproduct of the story we tell about our competence. When the internal narrative is critical and pessimistic, it triggers the stress response, leading to avoidance behaviors. This is the fear-failure avoidance loop. If you tell yourself you are socially anxious, you avoid social gatherings, which prevents you from developing social skills, which in turn reinforces the belief that you are socially inept. The neuroplasticity of belief. One might ask, if these stories are so ingrained, can they truly be changed? The answer lies in neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to recognize itself by forming new neural connections. Cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, is built on the premise that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected. By identifying cognitive distortions, such as all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, or labeling, individuals can learn to challenge the veracity of their internal scripts. When we consciously choose to replace a maladaptive thought with a more balanced one, we are effectively pruning old neural pathways and strengthening new ones. Strategies for rewriting your narrative. Rewriting a life story is not about lying to yourself or engaging in toxic positivity. It is about objective reauthoring. Here are 4 evidence-based methods for cognitive restructuring. 1 is externalization and distancing. Often, our internal narrative is colored by intense emotional involvement. Researchers recommend the technique of self-distancing, viewing your expressions from the perspective of an objective observer or a close friend. When you ask, "What would I tell a friend in this situation?" the narrative shifts from self-flagellation to problem solving. The shift reduces the emotional reactivity that often keeps negative stories in place. Identifying the origin story. To rewrite a script, you must understand where it came from. Many of our core narratives are formed in childhood as survival mechanisms. If you learned that remaining silent kept you safe from conflict as a child, that narrative may now be preventing you from setting boundaries as an adult. Recognizing that a narrative served a purpose in the past but is now obsolete is the first step towards discarding it. Redemptive sequences. Research by McAdams 2001 suggests that people with higher levels of psychological well-being often tell redemptive stories. A redemptive sequence involves a narrative arc where a negative event, a failure or a loss, is framed as a turning point leading to positive growth or insight. By consciously reframing past traumas not as the end of the world, but as the catalyst for my development, the emotional charge of the event changes. Behavioral experiments. Narratives are solidified through action. If you believe, "I'm not a confident public speaker," you must test that hypothesis by engaging in behavioral experiments. Small, low-stakes actions that contradict your narrative. You collect data that forces your brain to update its internal model. If you speak up in one meeting, the evidence begins to stack against the old narrative, eventually forcing a rewrite. The ethics and challenges of reframing. It is important to acknowledge that rewriting one's story is not a panacea for systemic issues or clinical level trauma. There's a fine line between empowering personal responsibility and engaging in victim blaming. External circumstances, poverty, systemic oppression, and genuine tragedy are real, and they shape our reality regardless of the story we tell. The goal of narrative work should not be to gaslight oneself into believing life is perfect, but rather to maximize one's agency with the circumstances that exist. It's about moving from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, as identified by Carol Dweck, 2006. In conclusion, you are the editor, not just the character. We're all born into stories we didn't write. The stories of our parents, our culture, and our early involvement. But as we transition into adulthood, the pen is passed to us. Rewriting your internal narrative is a lifelong iterative process. It requires radical honesty, the courage to challenge your own biases and the discipline to practice new ones. By shifting the narrative of victimhood to a narrative of agency, we gain the ability to change not just how we feel, but how we act, and ultimately, what we're capable of achieving. As the novelist Joan Didion famously wrote, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. If we're going to live, we might as well tell stories that allow us to thrive.